So it's day 255. And as I was going through today, just looking at article after article as I do to review the news, I was struck by how perspective plays at issue with what's going on. So what I mean by that is that we all bring a different perspective to this. If you're watching this, it's probably because you are sympathetic to a Ukrainian perspective. Um, but really, at the heart of the conflict is a conflict of visions, if I can borrow the phrase from Thomas Sowell's book, The Conflict of Visions. And borrowing another title, Ideas Have Consequences. And so I want to talk about perspective. So let's look, as we look through the articles for today's events, let's look at how perspective is at the heart of the conflict. So we're going to start here. This is yesterday, actually, not today. Russia is fighting sacred battle against Satan, says Medvedev. Now, this is the former president of Russia saying this is a sacred battle. What Russia is doing to Ukraine is a sacred battle against Satan. I would imagine that the Ukrainians would beg to differ, but here's what we have to say here in a message marking Russia's Day of National Unity on November 4th. Medvedev, now deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said that the task of the fatherland, that's Russia, was to, quote, stop the supreme ruler of hell, whatever name he uses, Satan or Lucifer or whatever. I mean, that's why they're in Ukraine? The perspective is frighteningly weird. They're also part of a growing effort by the Kremlin to cast the conflict as a righteous struggle against a decadent West, and that's been going on for some time, and crazy Nazi drug addicts. Okay, that was kind of new as of February, but the Satan himself thing, that's kind of new, have come out with statements that Russia is fighting in Ukraine against Satanists or the Antichrist himself. Well, that's quite a perspective. And, he came out to say that on National Unity Day. Now, how are the Ukrainians processing National Unity Day? Well, they waited to release this stamp. This is the stamp that commemorates the blowing up of the Kerch Bridge. They waited until National Unity Day to let that out. So they have a very different perspective of what they think about National Unity Day. By the way, National Unity Day was a day that, if I have my facts straight, was a Russian celebration of unity where they chased out the Lithuanians and Poles who had invaded Moscow, and later it was supplanted by kind of an October Soviet Revolution Day, and then it was brought back as National Unity Day for Russia. So, but what a different way of approaching National Unity Day in Russia and in Ukraine. We can see this in another way. Iran acknowledges sending drones to Russia for the first time, and they've acknowledged it on November 5th, but they insisted that the transfer came before Moscow's war on Ukraine. Now, they also lie, so it's yet to be determined whether that's actually true or not. But even if it is true, the Ukrainians look at that and say the Iranian Foreign Ministry publicly acknowledged this, and they're going to do everything possible to thwart what Iran's doing because they're supplying weapons to their adversary, and Iran has no business supplying weapons, and the Israelis are going to get involved if they supply even more weapons, or they're more likely to get involved, and we'll talk about the Israelis and their perspective at the end of this. But it's a really interesting thing. So, another perspective, there is a judge who sentenced 2 captured Britons to death in June. It was a big story, but at the time, he was safely, securely behind the Russian-occupied lines. Well, now he's had an attempt on his life, and he's in pretty bad shape. Well, why? Because of perspective. Because while he thought it was great to be doing what he was doing, sentencing the Ukrainians who are so bad to, and the Britons that came to fight for the Ukrainians to death. This was Sean Pinner and Aiden Aslin, and here they are. They actually were absolved, or not absolved, but they were traded back to their country. I'm sure there was some diplomatic effort. Yeah, some other people didn't like it, and there was an assassination attempt on his life. Again, perspective. Yesterday I talked about how some of the Russian news was somewhat misleading, and in fairness, I have to say that this particular article was somewhat misleading too because of the picture. Because I want to be fair to both sides, and I said yesterday that the Ukrainians tend to stop short of not telling the whole thing. But here, I was unsettled by this. And this is my perspective because I think journalism should be free and fair. And I think it ought to say exactly what is at the heart of it. Here you see a plane, but there was no plane here. So Ukrainians shot down 18 air targets, including 2 caliber cruise missiles, 2 helicopters, 11 Shahed UAVs, and 3 tactical UAVs. But there's no plane. And I think perspective says, don't do that. The more you stay away from the line, the more we can trust in you. So don't do that. That's perspective. So Russian troops loot Herzen as the lines are withdrawn ahead of this battle. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wait a minute. The message was that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that there are brothers. There's no nation that's called Ukraine. It's the same people. And the rationale was you had to go and get rid of those Nazis at the top who were keeping you from living together as brothers, but then your military goes and does this. There are things disappearing in the Ukrainian city of Herzen at a rapid rate. Russian troops are taking away ambulances, tractors, stolen private cars. Cultural things are going too. Archives, paintings, sculptures from the art and local lore museums. Even the bones of Catherine the Great's friend and lover, Grigory Potemkin. What? It doesn't seem to make sense. Nobody knows how many of Herzen's 300,000 pre-war inhabitants remain. According to relatives of those there, the city is mostly empty. What's going on? The Ukrainians have generational hatred now that they didn't have before. Certainly not before 2014, but definitely after 2022. But it's such a conflict in perspective. Now, Putin's an interesting case. He keeps his options open about drafting more Russians, although he declares that he has ended mobilization and doesn't need any more. In fact, before mobilization, it was all supposed to be this simple little thing over here in Ukraine, nothing to see here, we have it taken care of. And he's been trying to use that kind of strongman trope for a long time, but he can't have it both ways. He appears to have allowed for future waves of mobilization by not creating an edict that allows mobilization to be officially ended. Now, there's a reason for that, because while that's what the people might want in their perspective, read this line. The end of mobilization will automatically give all the mobilized contract soldiers the right to resign from military service. And we can't be doing that. In fact, I would predict that there's going to be another wave of mobilization down the line. He's going to need it. And he has also talked a lot about nuclear weapons and, we're going to use nuclear weapons, or the West wants to use nuclear weapons, or the Ukrainians are starting a dirty bomb, or you got to watch out for that kind of thing. But you know what? This is November 4th, 2022, and it's going to talk about, referred back to something in January. So President Xi said, Chinese President Xi said that Beijing's clearest response to Russian invasion of the former Soviet Union, the international community should, quote, jointly oppose the use or threats of nuclear weapons, advocate that nuclear weapons must not be used, and nuclear wars must not be fought in order to prevent a nuclear crisis in Eurasia, Xi said. That's a good line. And he referred in that to this. Xi's statement repeated China's pledge made in January alongside nuclear-armed France, Russia, Britain, and the United States to use atomic weapons only for defensive purposes. And that's all well and good. He's right. I agree. Now here's the article in the South China Morning Post. And you'll notice the date is 3 January 2022. This was before the invasion. And who are the players involved in this pact? The United States, China, Britain, France, and Russia. And yet, Putin has talked again about we're going to keep nuclear weapons on the table, and we're not going to do it, and there's no need, and there is, and what about? And he goes back and forth. And then beyond that, his former president in Russia, Dimitri Medvedev, said just the other day, follow the simple logic. If Russia can't win, then apparently Ukraine must. And Ukraine's war objective, as named by Kyiv's regime, is the return of all territories previously belonging to it. It's their separation from Russia. This, Medvedev explained, would qualify as a threat to the territorial integrity of Russia and therefore a direct reason for applying Clause 19 of the Russian state doctrine on nuclear deterrence, referring to the circumstances in which the use of atomic weapons by Moscow would be warranted. Wait, you grabbed land and now you're going to defend it, and that's warranted for nuclear? It's perspective. Perspective's at the heart of all this. Now, I've already gone into fun with Russian state media, so let's keep going. Here's another interesting one. Putin conducts a military training on delivering a retaliatory nuclear strike. Wait, we're just talking about the same kind of thing. What? Retaliatory nuclear strike? And wait a minute. Think about this as an American, or if you're a Western European, think about this if Joe Biden was giving a training, actually conducting the training for the Joint Chiefs of Staff about how to conduct a nuclear strike. You would think something's gone very wrong in the system, right? But that's not how it's played in Pravda. See, they're playing it that, see, Putin's on top of this. He's a strong man. See how he is training Sergei Shoigu? Where Sergei Shoigu, the head of the army, is saying, under your leadership, training is being carried out, during which the task of delivering a massive nuclear strike by strategic offensive forces in response to enemy nuclear strike will be worked out. And this is carried as news. And this is seen as a good thing, that Putin is training them on how to do this. It's a very strange perspective. Here's another strange one, but in a funny way. U.S. airline blocks out seats because passengers get heavier, says a report. Well, temporary change is a result of the increased average customer winter weights as prescribed by the FAA. Now, this is funny, haha, but this is going right to RT's perspective of Americans as fat and decadent and lazy and easy to conquer. More than 42% of U.S. adults are obese. The obesity epidemic is so severe, in fact, that nearly 71% of Americans born after 1997 are ineligible for military service, most commonly because they're too overweight to qualify, according to Pentagon data. They know what they're doing by proclaiming this. They're reaffirming their perspective. It's not that the United States military can't handle come what may. It's that they're viewing it through this prism. Here's another interesting one. A couple days ago, or yesterday actually, Benjamin Netanyahu was reelected as prime minister in Israel. But in RT, here's how it was carried. Israel's voters bring in radical ultra-nationalists too close to power. To get back into power, Benjamin Netanyahu had to make some deal with the group known for promoting Jewish supremacy and segregation. He's in with a bad lot. Ultranationalist Religious Zionism Alliance is celebrating its own rise to power, having gone from fringe to mainstream and possibly the second most powerful group in the government. However, the return to power of the longest-serving Israeli prime minister comes largely thanks to the rise of the infamous ultranationalist Religious Zionism Alliance, which Netanyahu had signed an agreement promising government positions in exchange for support. But why are they saying this? Well, scroll down to the end. And what you'll find is this: if Mahmoud Abbas is snubbed by Netanyahu and the Palestinian Authority, that's PA, is put into a chokehold under the influence of religious Zionism, the Palestinian Authority will be forced to either fight Israel or face possible rebellion from within. Now, why are they saying this? Well, because Russia is tied very closely to Iran, and Iran is the big supporter of the Palestinian Authority, well, and Syria, right? And so these guys all have that, they share that same perspective. Now, Israel has worked very hard to try to remain neutral between Ukraine and Russia because their perspective is they want to, wherever Jews are, that's their interest. But Russia doesn't share that perspective. In fact, all of this amounts to nobody seems to share the same perspectives, not in every way. You don't agree with me on everything, and I don't agree with you on everything, and that's okay. But once you understand perspective, things matter. Perspective like whatever was going on in Herzen that would allow Russian troops to devastate the place. We don't share the same perspective about the nature of human life or dignity or the democracy or the value of treating others in particular ways. In that perspective, those ideas are going to have consequences. And that's why this matters. And that's why we ought to think more about the conflict of perspectives. And if you liked what I had to say, please click like so that this perspective can be shared on YouTube. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me drone on and on about perspective because this matters. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.